Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. Today I'm doing a vinyl comparison video where I'll be comparing Cricut brand vinyl with the Paper Studio brand vinyl from Hobby Lobby. I'll be comparing the iron-on vinyl as well as the removable vinyl from both brands. I'll be going through step by step how each one cuts, how it weeds, and then how each one of the projects turns out at the end and which vinyl I thought was performing a little bit better. Again, I'm doing the Paper Studio removable and iron-on vinyls. I really hope that you enjoyed today's video, and I do want to thank Cricut so much for sponsoring today's video. Now let's go ahead and get right into it. First up, I'm going to be showing you how the Paper Studio iron-on vinyl performs. These are the two iron-on images I'm going to be using today. For the Cricut iron-on, I'm going to be doing the one that says Mama, and then for the Paper Studio one, I'm going to be doing the image that says Nana. And this is an image that was already uploaded into Cricut Design Space by one of their creators, and it's Lilium Pixel SVG, in case you guys are interested in her designs. So this is the Paper Studio solid iron-on vinyl that I'm going to be using in today's comparison video. And as you can tell, it is similar to the Cricut. It has the lining on the back that is really shiny, and then on the back side it is matte black. This is the color that I'm using, but the first thing I noticed about the vinyl is it feels very thin. I cut out a piece that was large enough for my design, and then I'm placing it onto my standard grip mat, but what I'm noticing is it is just wanting to roll right off of my mat, and my mat is very sticky, so I'm not sure why it was doing that, but what I ended up doing was just using some tape around all of the edges of the vinyl to make sure that it stays down and I'm able to cut out my image. The machine that I'm using to cut out my design today is the Cricut Explore 3. The vinyl did cut out really well, and I had the settings set to cut out for the iron-on vinyl and then also for more pressure. So once I removed the vinyl from my mat, it was still wanting to roll up. I could have left it on my mat and weeded it that way, but I didn't. So what I ended up doing was just re-taping it down to my table so that it would stay down instead of rolling up while I was trying to weed. So as you can notice, I'm going pretty slow when pulling the vinyl from around the image. It is kind of tearing a little bit because, like I mentioned before, I feel like this vinyl is pretty thin. Now, it did end up, weeding the way I wanted it to, but I did have to take a little bit more time and just be a little bit more careful so that I didn't rip any of the vinyl that I wanted to use on my design. For the smaller portions that I needed to weed out on the design, those ended up weeding just fine. I had no issues with that, but I did take my time and was careful because I knew that this vinyl did feel a little bit thin. To iron on my image, I'm using my Cricut EasyPress 2, and per Cricut's recommendations, I'm doing it at 350 degrees for 30 seconds for this white cotton t-shirt. This is the Gildan brand, and I did get this one from Michaels, and it's just your regular white cotton t-shirt. So the first thing I'm doing is taking the EasyPress 2 and just heating up the area where I'm going to be placing my design and getting it all prepped and getting all those wrinkles out. Next, I'm just placing the image right in the center, and I didn't have any issues with the backing sticking down at all. It stuck pretty well onto the shirt. And then since my image was a little bit larger than my heat press, I did have to do it in two different sections for 30 seconds for each section. And I had no issues whatsoever. And then once it was cooled down, then I removed the film on the front. And again, no issues with this as well. So overall, I think that the vinyl performed pretty well. I will say it is a little bit hard to work with when you're weeding because the vinyl does feel so thin. So just keep that in mind. But now we're gonna move on and see how the Cricut iron-on vinyl performs. Now for this one, I have noticed that the vinyl does feel a little bit thicker than the Paper Studio brand. And as you can see, this one is not wanting to roll up at all. And this was also on a roll, just like the Paper Studio one, but I've already cut it down to size. So this is the matte black that I'm using. It has the same shiny side on the front and the matte black on the back side. I'm placing it onto my mat the same as I did the Paper Studio brand. But as you can see, this vinyl is not wanting to roll up on my mat at all. But just to keep things the same, I am using tape around all of the edges of my vinyl because I want to stay consistent, and this is a comparison video. So now it's cutting the vinyl out. Again, I'm using the Cricut Explore 3 and it's cutting out great. I'm not having any issues with it cutting, and I did the same setting, the iron on, and then also more pressure. Now I'm gonna start weeding out the vinyl, but another thing that you can notice from the Paper Studio one is this is not rolling up at all, and the Paper Studio one was rolling up and gave me a little bit of a hard time. I'm weeding by starting in the very top left corner like I always do, and this was really, really easy to pull off. The vinyl was not like really tearing like the Paper Studio brand was, and I didn't have to be as careful when I was pulling the vinyl away. You can see that when I'm pulling the vinyl away that it is kind of staying in one giant piece, as to where the Paper Studio one was kind of a ripping here and there. Even though it ended up being okay, it was a little bit harder to work with. And then again, for all of the little areas that I had to weed, those were just fine. I had no issues with them. To keep things the same, I'm using the same white cotton Gildan t-shirt that I got from Michael's. I'm heating up the area where I'm going to be placing the image for about 5 seconds, and then I'm placing the image right in the center. I had no issues with it sticking onto my shirt, and then I did it in 2 sections with the Easy Press at 315 for 30 seconds for each section, just like I did when I used the Paper Studio. Then once it was cooled, I peeled away the top film, and I had no issues with it coming off, and my design ended up looking beautiful. Overall, between the 2 iron-on vinyls, the Paper Studio and the Cricut brand, I do like the Cricut one a lot better. It was easier to work with, and I didn't have any issues at all. And the Paper Studio was a little bit harder to work with since the vinyl did feel so thin. Next, I'm going to be showing you how the Paper Studio brand removable vinyl performs. I'm going to be using this image here that's already in Cricut Design Space, and it was created by this designer here, Takuni Design, I believe is how you say that. And like I said, this was already created and uploaded by them in Design Space. So this is the Paper Studio removable vinyl that I'm going to be using. It is a matte black, and it has the matte black top part, and then on the back side it has a grid pattern with the name the Paper Studio removable. So I just cut out a small piece and placed it on my standard grip mat, and I cut it out with my Cricut Explore 3. I did not have any issues with it sticking to my mat or cutting at all. But when I needed to weed the vinyl, this is where I started getting a little bit of trouble here, because the vinyl is really thin and the paper backing is also really thin. So I started at the top left corner and I weeded the larger amount around my design out, and that part was okay. I did take my time when doing it. It was all the little designs that I had to weed vinyl is where I had the trouble, because it was like it didn't cut very well, and I didn't notice that until I started weeding it. But I did do the setting for removable vinyl, and I did more pressure, so I shouldn't have had any trouble with it cutting. And it also was wanting to pull off of the backing here, and I think you can tell that I'm having a little bit of trouble getting some of those pieces out. This is what the design looked like once I weeded everything out. The top part you can see is a little wonky, and it just was not looking very nice. So now I'm going to show you how the Cricut removable vinyl performs and then do a little comparison. So here, this is the Cricut brand. It has the matte black on the front, and then on the back side, it does have a grid very similar to the Paper Studio, and it tells you what kind of vinyl. It is the removable vinyl. And then I'm just placing it on my standard grip mat here, just like I did with the Paper Studio brand. I had no issues with it sticking to my standard grip mat or any issues with it cutting out. Again, I put my settings at removable vinyl for more pressure. I weeded around the flower very nicely and easily, and then for all of the little details inside of the flower, those were also really easy to weed, and the cut on those was way better than for the Paper Studio brand vinyl. This is the image all weeded out. I think it turned out great. And then a side by side, the right one is the Paper Studio brand and the left is the Cricut brand. You can clearly see that the backing is a lot thicker on the Cricut brand. And then the two side by side that are weeded out, you can see that the Paper Studio one does not look as nice as the Cricut one. So I am definitely loving the Cricut one a lot better so far. To transfer them, I'm using my Cricut just transfer tape and just getting it pressed on with my scraper tool. The first one I'm doing is the Paper Studio one. It transfers just fine onto my Cricut transfer tape. And then I am going to be placing it on one of these blocks that I have painted with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. I just centered it and then pressed it on with my scraper tool, and I had no issues with the vinyl transferring. Now for the Cricut brand, I am using my Cricut transfer tape to get the image onto the tape and transferred onto another wood block that I've painted exactly the same with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory. I'm placing it in the center of the block and then using my scraper tool once again to press the image onto the block. I had no issues with the image sticking to the tape and not sticking to my block. Here's a side-by-side of the two. I do think the Cricut one turned out a lot better. The vinyl was easier to work with the Cricut. The Paper Studio one, you can see, has a lot of mess-ups, and the vinyl just does not look as nice. And that wraps it up for today. I hope that you guys enjoyed seeing today's comparison vinyl video. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you are not already. I do want to thank Cricut so much for sponsoring today's video. Thank you so much for watching.